Creating from the Heart, the Artistry of Living. I'm Susie Vance, and this morning I'm here with Linda Hart.
Linda Van Hart.
Linda Van Hart.
Susie Vance and Linda Van Hart.
Susie Vance and Linda Van Hart. So Linda, I know you, life is a journey. I know you know that. And I know that you do jewelry, which is fabulous, like the one around your neck. And you do these great sculptures, like the one that's in the back. I particularly like the wings.
That's in progress.
So, but I've heard stories about you, that somebody had other plans for you.
Yes,
when you were very little.
Interesting you should mention that. Yes, the Brandenburg side of my family are all very musical. My great-grandfather was notorious as the best musician and the best music teacher in our area. So,
and where was that?
In Carroll County, Maryland. I'm fifth generation Carroll County Marylander.
My goodness.
I travel all over the world, but that's home.
Okay.
So I was raised as a little teeny person playing piano. So when you see my hand, you'll notice I've got an octave reach. And I think that early training in piano has led to this manual dexterity that has fueled my ability to think and do in one continuous breath. And it also, performing, I guess, gave me the confidence to be a performer as a teacher in the classroom, but also as an artist in my studio and in the world.
And when you were performing as a child, where was this? I mean,
well, I started playing piano when I was 3, and I had a little step stool to get up to the stool to play the piano. Of course, I couldn't reach the pedals yet, but I was so nimble that they enlisted a teacher from Peabody, came to Sykesville. Mrs. Allport had the best tuned grand piano, and any of us that wanted piano lessons would go to Mrs. Allport's after school and play with this teacher from Peabody. Well, she decided I was going to be her Mozart prodigy, and at the age of 5, I played a piece on television. My mother curled my hair. I got to wear lipstick. I had a store-bought dress. And little Mary Jane's with the lace edge socks that rolled down. I was really something. And I played my piece, and at the end, I got to drink ginger ale, which I thought must be champagne because we didn't drink soda at my house. And it was just such a celebratory moment, you know. And then when I was 7, I played an original piece at Peabody called Moods and Modes. And soon after that, my teacher convinced my mother that I had to come home from school and practice for 2 hours every day. Well, in the winter, it was dark. I couldn't go out and play with my friends. I'm a kid.
At the end of your practice.
I'm a kid. You know, and she wouldn't let me play Latin American rhythms, and she wouldn't let me play by ear. It will ruin you as a classical scholar. So I rebelled. I sat at the piano and wouldn't touch it.
How long did that last?
Not quite a year, when they realized they were throwing their money away. You know, all along I was drawing. I'd take scraps out of the trash can so I didn't have any lines to color in between. You know, I do my own drawings on the back of documents and stuff that they'd thrown away. So I told the family when I was 5, when I was playing on TV and practicing piano, that I was going to be an artist, and they just assumed a musical artist.
Little did they know.
No. Well, I was pretty good at art in school and got the art award and all that. I wanted to go to the Maryland Institute and won a 4-year Ford Foundation scholarship based on my portfolio. But I was only 17, and my mom wouldn't sign the papers because she thought I'd become a street person in Baltimore. So I ended up accepting a full tuition scholarship to then Western Maryland College and majored in studio art.
Okay. And
I think sculptural, well, I was very good at realistic watercolor portraits, and was selling a lot of my batiks. I think the sculpture gene matures a little later than the two-dimensional gene.
Okay.
I think it takes a little longer. I mean, as a kid, I'd make rings out of copper wire and shells with holes in them. And our Aunt Virginia married into a local farm family, so we had seeds, and we'd paint them with nail polish and string them up. And dress up was always my favorite game. Like an old broken umbrella would become a flamenco skirt. So I was always doing stuff like that and wearing rings on every finger. My grandfather thought my mother should have named me Samantha, because when I was wearing my roll down lace edge socks I could be Samantha, but when I was hanging from trees I could be Sammy. And he was fond of Sammy Davis Jr., who of course wore rings on every finger.
Right.
He said, you and Sammy, you should have been named Sammy. So it's always been there.
So when you got out of college, what
My
happened
master's
next?
work, I'd signed up for a watercolor class with a woman of some renown at Towson University, and the class was full. I'd been sculpting stone. My mentor, Vasil Polishik from Western Maryland College, is from Ukraine. Fascinating life story and major influence on my life. And he worked in both 2- and 3-dimensional media and had found a cache of soapstone in a field where the family was raising a lot of foster children. So he paid them to dig soapstone for him and gave me a piece, and I started carving it, and I kept thinking, wow, this is really fun. So people were saying, look at all the jewelry you wear. Why don't you take a jewelry class since the watercolor class is full? And I started working with John Fix, who became my next major mentor. And after an electrifying first class, I went home and filled a new 5x7 sketchbook with all the ideas I was thinking of making in metal. And when I showed him the next day, he was just, anybody have a sketchbook? That was our assignment overnight. This is summer school by that time I was teaching. And I said, oh, I have one. And he said, well, how long have you been working on this? I said, maybe 12 hours. I could hardly sleep last night. I was so excited about this class. And he said, what about this design? It was sort of a pod form, a hollow, sinuous pod form that tapered. And he said, what is this? I said, well, it's like a stick pin or a hat pin. And he said, are you going to make that today? And I said, I'd like to make that today. Well, we were working. I mean, this was day 2 in class. And I made it, and he was rather shocked. So at that particular time, on the second day of class, he introduced the idea of diminished diameter forging to me.
Okay.
And that's become, what I'm wearing is diminished diameter forging. I love sensuous calligraphic lines. Like Robert Morris, I love Art Nouveau. Robert Morris said, you can lean on line like a staff. And I believe that. And in 3-dimensional work, it's physical, it's firm, it's not like a drawn line, it's not that ephemeral. So with diminished diameter forging, you take, the biggest I've ever used is gauge 0. When you're gauging metal, the larger the number, the smaller the wire. I guess original metalsmiths were dyslexic like me. And they just got it backwards. So I started out with a larger wire, and John hadn't intended this, but after he taught his lesson, he saw that I was sculpting the pod form and that I needed to, out of sheet, and I needed to add this stem. And he showed me how to do it on a rolling mill with an upright sander. You gradually diminish the thickness of the wire, but you have to keep it round and smooth. And then because it's work hardening, it goes through any surface, even the thin part, without bending. So that's what I'm wearing. You can see how thick this is. This is change of plane, so you get a nice thick idea, and then you go to this thin part that wraps around, and this is one wire. The thick wire here diminishes until it's thin enough to go through my ear. John and I had a huge argument about that. That same week we collaborated on a significant piece of diminished diameter forging, and we argued about the wire needing to be thin enough to go through the ear, because he was a very moral man. He was the son of a minister, and I'm like, how can you violate the integrity of that wire by soldering a post on it when the whole idea is you're reducing it from thick to thin? Why can't it go through your ear? And mind you,
he didn't even want it to go through
that
the ear,
particular
right?
pair, which I have and wear, have two of our initial arguments. One about the integrity of the wire going through your ear. He soldered a post on it. And the other was about having a kinetic feature. Life is all about slithering and wriggling and shimmying your way through any situation. And you need a little kinetic feature. I think an object in motion tends to stay in motion, and I like that. Physics is...
It's like people. They always stay in motion. They rarely sit.
An object at rest tends to stay at rest. And we'll do a lot of that after we're dead. You know?
Okay.
Until then,
shimmer on.
Let's stay in motion. So
Linda, show us some of your creations.
Well, let's see. Early on, I began a pod-like form. Here's an early example. These are from our private collection. This is my sister's. It's kind of a shell-like form. You see the rounded pod-like. This is called repousser. It's a French word that means to push. So I'm using tools to push flat metal to create contours. I'm using hammers on the other side, chisels, many of which I make myself specifically for each job, so that one chisel mark, very efficient. We're Germanic, very efficient, one chisel mark. Like in this ivy leaf, for example, you can see the length of the vein in the ivy leaf. I made a tool to make that one mark. I have another tool. This is a shorter vein and a shorter vein. So I have 3 tools that I made out of tool steel that allow me to work in this scale as efficiently as possible. That's different. You can see the difference between this ivy circlet, which was amongst my earliest ivy circlets back in the 80s. And there was much more work going on, and it was unnecessary. So I've learned how to economize and make the piece a little more powerful. So although I am a botanical portrait artist, I'm an efficient botanical portrait artist with a mission to interpret historic botanical symbols in contemporary ways. Like the ivy and the grape were on the staff of Osiris in ancient Egypt. And he is mythic for his beneficent leadership. He was a loved leader. Those symbols came across the Atlantic, so ivy is a symbol of eternal love and beneficent leadership, and grapes, of course, are a symbol of bountiful harvest because there was no famine when he was ruling. And these two symbols joined each other and crossed the Mediterranean to be woven into the laurel wreath of Bacchus, whom we know loved to party. And so I love the symbology of plant forms marching down through history. This particular one, when I was in Italy, I noticed the acanthus leaf. I searched it out because the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore is really famous, originally a private collection that was given to the city of Baltimore, is world famous. And their vase collection is much superior to that in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So one of the curators put together the lives of Greek women as displayed on Greek vases. Not goddesses, but normal Greek women, because in Greece, women were educated, they were allowed to own land, they were allowed to divorce their husbands, they were much more independent than in maybe many of the neighboring societies. So there was a palmette. In the row between the narrative rows were decorative bands, separating. Like in cartoons, you've got rows of images.
Yeah.
Well, this was kind of the Greek version of a cartoon on a Greek vase. So the narration is happening and it's separated by decorative bands. And in those was the palmette with an acanthus leaf. Well, we don't have acanthus growing everywhere in America, but we have grapes. And grapes, this became a symbol of independent women based on reference of Greek women who were independent. So that was one of my earliest series.
I love it.
And I tend to work in a series because the question, what if, is of great significance to me. I know in your fiber work, I know, your fiber, what if I did this instead of that? And so like, what if instead of a post earring, I put on a French wire that had some wiggle like the grapevine. And that series just kept going on through the late 80s into the 90s. And I branched out, brought in the ivy, brought in many other plant forms.
So this is a far cry from the piano.
Yes.
But it isn't a far cry from your creativity, which wasn't allowed to be expressed in the piano, but you can express now in any way you want.
And it is a far cry from the censorship and forcefulness I had in my family in my early years as to my personal direction to what I asked of my students. I asked them to find their own voice. And in doing so, they had to gain confidence, and through creative problem solving that happens. The question, what if? And once you say to yourself, what if, and you get a big idea, and it all of a sudden it scares you, then you've got to break it down. Well, what do I do first? How can I sequence these steps? I want to achieve this goal. I've never done this before. I don't know how to go about it. Do I seek resources? Do I go to a person and ask a question? Or do I experiment, fool around and play and discover stuff new,
all by yourself?
All by yourself on the way. And in so doing, you find your voice. I'm 60 inches tall. I like big. My voice is big. My confidence has grown over the years. And many of my students, in the letters that I get 10, 20 years out, thank you for asking me to find my own voice. I wrote a letter of recommendation to a very talented student. He was pre-med. His name is Alex Vizano. Alex, good morning. He couldn't get into med school, and he was brilliant and funny and wonderful. And so I wrote a letter of recommendation that said, this young man can work ambidextrously with tools in both hands and make quick and accurate decisions under pressure. Now, what characteristics do surgeons need? What characteristics do doctors need? He submitted this to another med school, and in August, when he thought all hope was lost, he got in. He's like, thank you for that letter of recommendation. But it was based on what I teach, breaking things down until you feel you can achieve the goal, what you have in your head. And
sometimes it also surprises you because you go beyond.
Yeah. And continue.
Keep going.
And continue, because what if keeps coming. So there's, you wake up in the morning and you're like, what if?
Yes.
And you go to the studio, and at the end of the day, you're like, wow, didn't know I was going there.
Well, thank you so much. This has been energizing, to say the least. So I hope you all find your voice. Linda Van Hart is giving you permission to do that.
Good luck.
Creating from the heart, the artistry of living. Susie Vance.